Chapter 11, as we are nearing the end of the book. There's a sense as you read Ecclesiastes, and I have no doubt that those who originally received it, you read the book, and the writer is honest, and he's honest really maybe even to a fault. Because he says life is chaotic, life is painful, life is unexpected. So much happens in life that we can't control. Things happen beyond our ability to stop them. Things happen that hurt us. Things happen that will attack us. There is persecution. And all this because sin is in the world. And you almost get this feeling as you're reading the book that you say, well, then I'm just packing it up. If all this stuff happens and the book keeps reminding me over and over and over that there's always going to be things beyond my ability to control them. There are always going to be painful things that happen in life. That this world, because it's stained by sin, it's going to be difficult to live in it. Our reaction sometimes is, well, I'm just going to go over here and I'm just going to keep to myself and I'm not really going to do anything and I'm just going to wait. I'm just going to wait till I die. I'm going to wait till Christ comes back. But if what is certain in this life is loss and hurt, then I just don't want to risk anything. But now, as we get towards the end of the book, the writer of Ecclesiastes, this preacher, he says, you know what? It is true that you may spend your life risking and it may lead to nothing. It is true that you may try with all your might and your life is full of disappointment and pain and hurt are recurring in it. It's true that all that could happen. But what is also true is if you do nothing, you're going to miss so much that God has for you. If the uncertainty of life creates this fear in you that just says don't do anything, he says you're going to miss all these opportunities that God gives us. You're going to miss all these divine appointments that God puts in our lives for us to be a blessing to others or for God to teach us and show us something about Himself. And so as he moves towards the conclusion of the book, he really wants to encourage us to invest our lives for God. Right? To take all that we have and all that we are and go all in. To put everything we have and all the energy we have and everything that God has given us, to invest it on a daily basis to serve God. And so here we're going to look at these first 6 verses of chapter 11. And he uses a lot of financial metaphors. He uses farming metaphors, business metaphors, to show us that our lives are to be invested for God and for His kingdom. So look with me beginning in verse 1 of chapter 11. He says, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. If a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. All these statements that he gives us, he is giving us to help us, to encourage us to invest our lives for God. And he gives us 5 truths that will help us go all in, that will help us invest everything for God. The first truth is this: we must take risks for God if we want to make an impact for God. If you want to make an impact in this world, it requires taking risks. He says there in verse 1, he uses a very curious metaphor, one that doesn't really make sense to us. He says, cast your bread on the waters. and it may come back to you. Now, if we read this, perhaps what we are thinking is, well, I'm just going to go get a piece of bread and I'm just going to throw it on a pond and let's see what happens. And we would see it, and if you throw that piece of bread, it's just going to get soggy and sort of dissolve. We need to understand something about the distance between us and this text, because when this was written, this would have been a fairly common phrase. Several other documents from around this period use a phrase similar to this. And what it refers to is commerce. It refers to foreign trade. It was an agrarian society where people grew a lot of grain. And what it's talking about is you take your grain, you put it on these boats, and these boats would go and they would carry it to another place where it would be sold, and then eventually it would come back to you. Right? But to do that, that's a risk. You are risking. You're taking your grain. Your other option is you can take the grain that you have raised, that you've grown. You can make bread with it, but then that's all you've got. You've got bread and a lot of grain. But this what the preacher here he's saying take your grain, take it, send it out there, sell it, and let it come back to you. He's talking about taking risk. Right? The idea here, in essence, the way we might say this, is no risk, no reward. Following God requires risk. There is no following God apart from risk. Think about it. There's a man who lives somewhere in the ancient East, and God comes to him and he says, hey, I want you to build this giant ship because in a few years there's going to be a great flood that comes. Do you think that required some risk to be obedient there? Some risk, not only to go collect everything, risk to build everything, risk. I mean, Noah, when he built that ark, he put everything into it. Several years later, there was another man in the city of Ur. And he hears God say to him, go until I tell you to stop. And Abram packs up everything he has. He takes all his possessions. He takes his family. He takes his slaves. He takes everything, and he just goes. Don't you think that's a risk? Right? God doesn't even say, Abram, I want you to go to this place called Canaan. He doesn't even tell him where he's going. He just says, go until I say stop. Why Paul? Here's Paul. Paul is this rising star of Judaism. He knows the law backwards and forwards. He's one of the most brilliant scholars they've got. He's trained under the most well-known and respected rabbi of his day. And he's walking, he's riding to a persecution, he's traveling, and Jesus appears to him and says, why are you persecuting me? Within days, Saul understands that his only hope is to follow this risen Christ. You think that takes risk? He had to totally break ties with his past. He had to give up everything. He had to forsake everything he had ever been taught. He had to abandon his family probably because they would want nothing to do with one of these followers of Jesus. Jesus comes and Jesus is walking. And how does Jesus call the disciples? He catches them all in the middle of doing something. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, follow me. He doesn't say, now I want you to wrap up your business and kind of get things settled in your life. And then, right, following God, being obedient to God, it always requires risk. Our problem is we don't want to risk anything to follow God. We only want to follow God when we feel it's safe, when we feel it'll cost us nothing. But that time will never come. In our country, we get panicked because we think, heaven forbid if following God costs us anything in America. We look back on this mythological time where we have created that following God didn't cost anything, and we think, wouldn't that be wonderful? There has never been a point in human history where following God didn't cost something. There has never been a point in human history where following God did not put you on the outside of society. There were times when professing religion made you comfortable, but that professing religion is radically different than following Christ. Following God, following Christ, it always requires risk. And the preacher here is saying, if you really want to make an impact in this world, if you really want to change things, if you really want to do something, you have to risk something. The only way we're going to be fruitful in this life is by making effort, by taking risk. We will never accomplish anything if we do nothing. So often we want to change things, but we're not willing to do anything. We say, well, I want my country to change. I want my church to change. I want my family to change. But we sit around and we do nothing. We don't make any efforts. We don't make any strides to become more Christ-like. But we just complain about the way things are. Listen, if we don't do anything, then we're not going to change anything. We're not going to impact anything. If we want to do something, if we want to make a change in our world, if we want to impact our world for Christ, if we want to impact our community, if we want to impact our church, if we want to impact our family, it starts with us being willing to do something. It starts with us saying, I will risk whatever I need to risk. But the one thing I will not settle for is things staying the way they are. The one thing I can't settle for is doing nothing. Well, Jesus told a story about this, didn't he? Jesus said there's a wealthy man and he is going away, and so he gathers 3 of his servants, and one of them he gives 5 talents to, one of them he gives 2 talents to, and one of them he gives 1 talent to. And while he's gone, the man with 5 talents, he invests it and he works and he earns back another 5 talents. The man that he gave 2, he works and he invests and he earns another 2 talents. But the guy he gave 1, he said, he is a cruel man, and I don't want to lose this 1 talent, so I'm just going to save it. I'm going to tuck it away. And he buries it, and when his master comes back, he says, see, I didn't lose what you gave me. And do you remember what Jesus says the response of the master is to his servant? He says, you wicked and lazy servant. He doesn't just say, I'm a little disappointed in you. He doesn't say you could have done better. He calls him wicked and lazy. Think about that. To do nothing, to accept the status quo, to not take any risk, Jesus calls it wicked and lazy. If we want to follow God, the only way we do it is when we risk obedience. Obedience will always cost us. It may cost us energy, it may cost us money, it may cost us time, but obedience will always cost us something. And if we go through life afraid to take risk, if we go through life saying, I just don't know that I want to pay what that cost, Jesus' estimation of that sort of life is that it is wicked and it is lazy. We have to take risk. We waste our life if we do nothing because we fear loss. We look at people and we say, I know they need help, but I just don't know that I have the time to help them. I'm afraid if I help them out, then I'll just waste my time. I'm afraid if I help them out, I'll just waste my money. I'm afraid if I help them out, I'll just waste my energy. You know what? You never know until you try. You never know until you cast your bread out on the water. See, to cast it out, it requires patience. That's the point here. He says, you will find it after many days. The book of Kings tells us that when Solomon sent his fleets out with grain, it would take about 3 years for him to come back with a return. So often our problem is, if we don't get immediate results, we just give up. Right? We can't give up if there aren't if there are not immediate results. What we do is we say, well, I'll help. And we talk to somebody and they say, well, it didn't help, so I'm done with them. I helped them out one time and things are still tough in their life. I helped them out one time. They didn't accept Christ. I helped them out one time. They're still in trouble. I'm just done with them. That's not how God treats us. Right? The writer here, the preacher says it will take many days for it to come back. There needs to be patience. If we're going to invest our life, if we're going to take this risk, we have to be patient. And note, it may take years. Can I tell you something, parents? It takes years sometimes for your kids to get to the right spot in their life. The worst thing you can ever do is just give up on them. Husband, wife, it may take your spouse years for them to get where they need to be. You can't give up on them. You need to look and wait for many days. That's what he says. If you're going to invest yourself, if you're going to take risk, it requires this patience that says, I'm going to take many days. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to keep risking. Because it is foolish for us to say, well, I'll give a little bit, but if it doesn't happen on my timetable, if it doesn't happen the way I want, then I'm done. That's not any risk for the kingdom. So the first encouragement he gives us is we have to take risk if we want to make an impact. The second encouragement is that we must enthusiastically look for multiple opportunities to serve. Again, he takes a financial principle and he applies it to our lives. He says there in verse 2, give a portion to 7 or even to 8. Again, redneck Kentucky language for financial advice. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. He's saying diversify your portfolio. If you want to invest well and wisely, you don't just buy one stock. You don't just put your money in one thing, because if that one thing crumbles, then that's everything. And so any sound financial advisor would tell you, you need to have it in several places. But here, the preacher is applying that same kind of advice to life. Don't just look for one thing. Don't just put your whole life on one thing. See, the reason I think he's not talking just about financial things is he uses a common biblical formula. You see, he says, give to 7 or even to 8. What he does is sort of X plus 1. You see this throughout the Bible. Jesus tells people, he says, if somebody asks you to walk a mile, I tell you, walk how many miles? 2. Go that extra mile. So often in the Old Testament, God says things like, for 3 transgressions, even for 4, I will forgive you. For 3 transgressions. In essence, it's this notion that the Bible keeps giving us. It's a way of saying, don't do the minimum. And if we want to make an impact, if we want to invest our life for God, we've got to look for multiple avenues to impact people. We've got to look for multiple avenues to serve. We've got to look for multiple things to pour our time and our energy into. Because if all our life is wrapped up in one thing, should that one thing fail, we feel empty. People who make their whole life about their job. They pour their life into their job. They want to have an excellent job. They want to have a certain job title. They pour their whole life into it. And then something unforeseen happens in the company, and one day they're without a job. And what has been that person's entire life now is nothing. People who pour their whole life into a family. Something that happens in the family, it's gone. One of the biggest mistakes I think that husbands and wives make is they pour all their life into their kids. And you think on the surface that sounds like a good thing. But then the kids leave home, and a husband and a wife are left with living with another person they don't really even know. If we pour all of our life into one thing and that one thing doesn't pan out, it just leaves us feeling empty. And in the same way, if all of our life is about just one thing, if my life is about money and my money dries up, I'm empty. If my life is about this one particular, even good things, even if my life is about this one particular ministry and something happens, I'm done. That's why the preacher here, he's encouraging us, don't just serve in one thing. Don't just do one thing. Look for multiple avenues to serve. Look for multiple people to bless. You know, one of the problems that we have sometimes as Christians is we just sort of cloister up. We just huddle up with one another. And we've got one group of friends and we've got one group of people that we just spend our time with. And those are the people we pour into, but then we've got nothing one day. That's why the preacher's saying that we need to enthusiastically, we need to look, not for just one opportunity to serve, not for just a couple things, but we need to constantly be looking for people to bless. We need to be constantly looking for ways to serve. If we want to maximize our efforts, we need to diversify our energy. If I want to be the most profitable I can be for the kingdom of God, I cannot just be wrapped up with one thing. I need to be doing several things. So he tells us, secondly, we must enthusiastically look for multiple opportunities to serve. But his third encouragement is that we need to serve now and not put off what can be done. In verses 3 and 4, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. Again, there's a return to one of the major themes of Ecclesiastes, and that is you just can't control life. Either way, he says you see a cloud full of rain, right? If you're a farmer, you stand off and you've got stuff to do, but you see this big dark cloud coming, you know, hey, rain's about to come. And even if you know it's about to come, there's still nothing you can do to stop it from coming. So there are things that we expect, times we expect for our plans to be derailed, but we still can't stop it. We can't plan for it. We can't plan around it. But at the same time, things happen that we have no control over. Things happen we can't plan for. Things happen we don't expect. He talks about a tree falling. Either way, we can't do anything about that. And then in verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. Procrastination is the enemy of the Christian. We feel like we can just wait. I'll do that later. I'll go talk to them later. I'll bring them a meal later. I'll go encourage them later. I'll call them later. Here's the problem. We're never promised later. Later may never come. Well, this week, we're reminded, you see on the news, here's a group of people having a Christmas party. 14 of them never left. 14 people went into this Christmas party and stepped into eternity. I have no idea their spiritual condition. I have no idea whether they were ready or not. They woke up that morning thinking we're going to have fun, we're going to celebrate with friends. And in the blink of an eye, they were standing before a holy God. That ought to sober us. That ought to awaken us. As Christians, we ought to be far more concerned about that than we are some of the political stuff surrounding this. We're not promised later. We could die at any minute. Christ could return at any minute. I just read not a couple weeks ago about a preacher. Preached and died right in the middle of his sermon. It can happen. Listen, we're not promised later. And it is Satan who whispers into our ear, that horrible word of wait. The writer here, the preacher, he's talking about this guy, this farmer, and he's looking at the clouds and he's looking at the skies. But because all he's doing is looking, because all he's doing is planting, he's got a handful of seeds, but he never sows because he's just watching. He never does anything because he's just watching. And one of the most harmful things Christians do is just stand around and watch. We just stand around and we wait. See, there is this myth that we have bought into called the perfect time. Well, it just wasn't time yet for me to talk to them. I'm waiting for the perfect opportunity. I'm just waiting because one of these days I know this perfect opportunity is going to come. I'm waiting for this perfect time for me to tell this person about Christ. I'm waiting for this perfect time for me to share with them who He is. I'm waiting for this perfect time to start talking about eternity. I'm waiting for this perfect time. You know when the perfect time is? Now. The perfect time is now. We can't afford to wait. We can't afford to buy into this lie that the perfect time, there is no such thing as the perfect time. There is no such thing as when all these stars align and I will tell them about Jesus Christ, and because everything in their life is corresponding and everything in their life is just hitting, they'll automatically respond. What ends up happening, though, is we keep waiting and we keep waiting and we keep changing our definition of the perfect time to allow us more time to stall. There's no such thing as the perfect time. The perfect time is whenever opportunity presents itself. If all I'm doing is I'm waiting, if all I'm doing is waiting, then I'm not being obedient. See, we need to be more concerned with the idea of too late than we are with the idea of a perfect time. We say, Michael, this person is hard, and if I talk to them too soon, then they'll just never accept. Yeah, but we don't know that. What we do know is if something happens, if Christ returns, it's too late. Then that's all that there is. And if Christ returns, it's too late to accept. If someone dies, it's too late to accept. We need to be more concerned with this idea of too late. We need to realize we are on a timetable. Christ is going to return. He's coming back. One of the things that I think we so often miss at Christmas is the first half of a story. But the coming of Christ at Christmas ought to cause us to look forward to the return of Christ in the future. And the coming of Christ at Christmas ought to ready us for His return. And it could happen at any moment. It could happen at any time. That's what Jesus says. He's coming like a thief in the night. Thieves do not call ahead and send a bunch of signals and say, hey, are you going to be home at 11 o'clock on Thursday? No reason, just curious. They come when nobody's expecting it. They come in secrecy. They come hidden. They come when nobody is aware, when nobody's prepared. That's how Jesus says He's coming back. And if all we do is wait for the perfect time may not present itself because too late may come first. So we have to serve now and not put off what can be done. Our fourth encouragement is we must trust in God to help us through our limitations and all our endeavors. The preacher here, he says in verse 5, you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In essence here, he just kind of admits his limitations. He marvels how life is formed in the womb. In this day, they didn't have ultrasounds. They didn't have technology to help them see the formation of the life in a womb. Now we can go and you get that ultrasound and see that heartbeat. They didn't have any of that. And he says, I don't understand how life forms. I don't understand how a human being forms inside the body of its mother. My mind can't wrap around that. I don't understand that. But you know what I do know? God knows how it happens. And not only does God know how it happens, He's behind it. In essence, what He is doing is He is admitting His limitations. There's so much in life we don't understand. There's so much in life we will never understand. There's so much about life we can't wrap our minds around. We ask questions of why, and we seek for explanations, and there are no answers for them. And the preacher here, he's saying, occasionally he hits that limitation. Occasionally he says, there's just things I don't understand. There are things that my mind cannot comprehend. There are things that are far beyond me. And not only do I not understand all God's doing in this world, I just don't understand everything there is to understand about God. But what He does is He says, when we find those limitations, when we come to those places where we say, I don't understand everything God's doing, and I don't understand what's happening here, what we rest in is not just the confidence that God knows what's going on, but that God is doing something about it. See, those times when we don't understand what's happening, those times where we are at our limitations, where our abilities can't go any farther and our understanding of the world can't go any farther. The preacher's saying God is still at work in those times. God is doing things we can't understand and things we can't see. What happens so often is we come to those times when we don't understand stuff and we say, well, I just don't understand this. I give up. I don't understand this. I don't see what God's doing. I can't comprehend this. I'm quitting. I'm giving up. I'm going to take the easy way out. I'm looking for shortcuts. But the preacher is reminding us that even when we don't know, God knows, and God's doing things we can't see. God's doing things we can't understand. He knows what we don't know. See, instead of my limitations creating fear within me, I can be encouraged and emboldened by the hope that there is nothing that limits God. When I find those limits, right, when God calls me to step out and take risk, and I say, God, I don't know. How am I going to pay for that? God, where am I going to get the time to do that? God, how is this going to work? I don't understand the logistics. And all those limitations create this fear within me, where everything inside of me is wanting to say, no, God, I can't do it. No, God, I'm not able. God, this is beyond me. God, this is too much for me. God, I can't. Instead of focusing on my fear at my own limitations, the preacher is taking our eyes off of us and then just putting it on a God who is always at work, for whom there are no limits. Is there anything too big for God? No. But we act like there is. Is there any problem too puzzling for Him to solve? No. We act like there is. As Christians, we ought not have fear. The reason we get afraid of the unknown, the reason we get afraid of our limitations is because our hope and our faith is in us and in our abilities, not in God. The reason fear creeps into my life is because I only feel confident when I feel like I'm in control of the situation. But that is foolish to assume I will always be in control. Sarah might tell you it's foolish to assume I'm ever in control. But the reality is God is always in control. There is nothing that sneaks up on God where He says, oops, didn't mean for that to happen. Now what am I going to do? The same God who works in ways we can't see and can't understand in our anatomy, in our physiology, and in the world around us is working in ways we can't see and understand for us. we need to trust in Him and have this hope and this courage that nothing limits Him. But the final encouragement He gives us is we must always be at work for God and for His kingdom. In verse 6, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. What's he saying? We must always be at work. As Christians, we always need to be working for the kingdom of God. Everything we do, we need to look and see, what opportunities do I have to be a blessing to people? What opportunities do I have to share the good news of Christ with others? What opportunities do I have to show others something about God's character? As Christians, we always need to be at work for God. He says, sow day and night. Right? See, if I'm always sowing, eventually there will be fruit. You ask a farmer, if he just goes around and he's constantly throwing seed down in a field, eventually, something's going to sprout up. And so as Christians, if we are always sowing seed, if we are always seeking to honor Christ in our attitudes and in our actions and through our words, if we're always seeking to glorify Him in our lives, if we're always making life about Him, if we're always working on His behalf, we're always looking for people to bless, we're always looking for people to encourage, we're always seeking to honor Him, guess what? Eventually, it'll happen. But the inverse is, if I'm never sowing, there'll never be fruit. If I'm not putting down seed, if I'm not sowing, if I'm not planting, nothing's going to come up. If a farmer doesn't put any seed down, and then come the fall, he says, where's all my corn? You think, hey, I got a friend I need to get you an appointment with. But that's how Christians go through life. See, the question, sometimes we think, well, when's the last time I led a person to Christ? When's the last time somebody came to church with me? The problem isn't that our results are lacking. The problem is that our efforts are lacking. Because if you have a hard time remembering the last time you led somebody to Christ, if you have a hard time remembering the last time somebody came to church with you, I would guess it's because you also have a hard time remembering the last time you shared the gospel with somebody. Or you have a hard time remembering the last time you invited somebody with you. If we're always sowing, if we're always at work, there's eventually going to be fruit. But if we're not doing anything, there's never going to be fruit. And we as Christians, we sit around and we are waiting for results when we've not put in any work up front. We haven't been sowing, but we expect there to be this fruitfulness. We expect to grow in God. We expect to grow in our knowledge of God. We expect to deepen in our intimacy with Him. But we're not studying His Word. We're not spending time in prayer. Everything we're doing is at a purely superficial level. We say, God, I don't know why I'm not growing. And we haven't opened our Bible all week. The only time we're learning about God is on Sundays and maybe on Wednesdays. And we're expecting a harvest when there's nothing that was planted. Jesus, again, He tells a parable. A man goes out and he sows. He's not responsible for what kind of soil that fell on. The man who sows, it falls on different kinds of soil. But eventually some of that seed, it takes root and it grows and it bears fruit. And if as Christians we want there to be a fruitfulness in our life and around our life, it only happens when we're sowing seed. We cannot expect to have growth. We cannot expect to see effects and fruitfulness when there's no effort being put in. And so all of these things, all of these encouragements, right, we see the way the world is headed, and we understand the pain of life, and we know Christ is returning, and that sinfulness within us wants to convince us we just need to hit cruise control and ride this out. We don't want to share the gospel and people think that we're crazy. We don't want to share the gospel and people think, oh, you're one of those kind of Christians. We don't want things to get uncomfortable for us. We've got other things we want to spend our time doing instead of growing in God. We've got other things that we feel is more deserving of our time. And we just want to wait and think, as long as I get to heaven, everything's fine. But what we do in the meantime is we miss out on all this stuff that God has got for us here. We miss out on all these opportunities we have to serve Him. We miss out on all these opportunities we have to be a blessing. We miss out on the opportunities we have to see God's grace take hold of someone's heart and new life begin in them. And if we spend our lives just waiting and doing nothing, then we will stand before our Master as wicked and lazy servants. But if we take all these opportunities God has given us and we understand every day we live is a gift that God gives us for us to give back to Him. Every moment of every day is a gift that God gives us for us to give back to Him in encouraging others and blessing others and serving others and sharing the good news with others, of reflecting His goodness through us, of showing others His love in the way I interact with them, of telling them about what Jesus came to do for them. If I understand that every moment of every day is a gift that I give back to Him, then I take all God has given me and I risk everything for Him, knowing that because He is in control and because He is on the throne and because His word is truth, there will always be some fruit. There will always be fruitfulness from those things I endeavor for Him. And I become far more concerned about standing before Him with a life that bears no fruit than I do risking the temporary, earthly things of this life in order to make an impact for Him. Listen, Christ has come and He's coming again. And we need to live to be ready to stand before Him. But we also need to live to equip those around us to be ready for His coming. Because when He comes, it will be too late. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess, but not every knee will bow in adoration. Not every tongue will confess He's Lord in praise. But every opportunity God gives me, I need to be working so that those in my life, when He comes back, when they meet Him, they bow before Him, worshiping Him and celebrating Him as King. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, You are so gracious to us in giving us opportunities to be a blessing for You, to give us opportunities to minister to others in Your name. And Father, I pray that we are always taking risk to be obedient. Whatever we have, our time, our energy, that we will risk it in order to be obedient to whatever You're calling us to do, to take advantage of whatever opportunities You present before us. Father, forgive us for being wicked and lazy, for taking the blessings that you give us and just wanting to keep them for ourselves and just stow them away. For not trying to multiply. Father, even now, I pray that you would put people in our minds and on our hearts we need to quit waiting to talk to. We need to quit waiting to be a blessing to. We need to quit waiting to serve. Father, I pray that we would be active now. Lord, I pray that if there's anyone here this morning who understands that their great need is to have a relationship with you, Father, that they would not put that off. They wouldn't procrastinate. But if you are calling them, if your Spirit is working in them, Father, they need to respond now. It's not trying to scare anybody to say we're not promised tomorrow. It's a fact. You could return. Something could happen. So, Father, if you're speaking now, we need to obey now. Whatever it is and whatever that means. Lord, I pray that whatever it is you're calling us to do, we would respond immediately. Father, we thank you for Christ, for the gift that he gave us. May we return that through our obedience, through our faithfulness. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.